The wind shifted, carrying the sharp scent of wet ash down the hill. Fire crews were rolling up hoses, calling out to each other as the engines shut down one by one. The last sliver of daylight drained behind the ridge, leaving the sky a soft gray blue, the kind that felt more like a bruise than evening. I pulled my jacket tighter and started the walk toward my truck. Halfway there, I looked back at the blackened skeleton of my house. The roof had folded in on itself. One wall leaned outward like a tired shoulder. Smoke rose in thin strands from the wreckage. Somewhere beneath that mess were photographs, tools, letters from my wife, things the fire took quickly, without apology. My hand rested on the warm hood of the truck before I realized I'd stopped moving. I stood there a moment longer, listening to the ticking metal as it cooled. Then I opened the door and slid inside. The silence in the cabin felt heavy, like someone else had been waiting there. I put the truck in gear and let it crawl down the hill. Gravel cracked softly beneath the tires. The headlights traced long shadows across the pines lining the road. As the ridge rose behind me, the memory of another day crept forward. The day I'd first come home to this land. It was early spring then, still cold enough that the wind carried a bite. I'd driven up the same road towing a small trailer of tools and half my life in cardboard boxes. Lily was asleep in the passenger seat, exhaustion from grief settling into her small shoulders. Losing her mom at 12 had hollowed her out in ways I couldn't fix. All I could do was bring her someplace quieter, someplace familiar, someplace with more sky than noise. Redwater Ranch was that place. The old porch creaked when we stepped onto it. Dust motes drifted in the slanted morning light inside the foyer. The house smelled of pine and old books. Lily had leaned her head against my arm. "It feels like Mom," she whispered. For the first time in months, she had slept through the night. I'd barely begun unpacking when the knock came. 3 sharp raps, crisp and businesslike. I'd opened the door to find a woman standing on the step, straight-backed, perfectly dressed, smile tight as a drum. "Good morning," she said, offering a manicured hand. "I'm Bethany Whitfield, president of the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association." I'd taken her hand briefly. "Jake Remy just moved in." "So I see." Her eyes flicked past me into the house, though I hadn't invited her in. "We've been waiting to welcome you. This property, of course, falls under HOA jurisdiction." I raised an eyebrow. "Does it?" "Oh, certainly," she said, drawing a thick folder from her tote. "Our lakeside beautification standards, safety regulations, and community expectations apply to all properties on Redwater Ridge and the connected shoreline." "My deed says otherwise," I replied. "This ranch predates Willow Ridge by about 40 years. It's exempt." Her smile didn't fade, but it changed, like tightening a screw by one last turn. "Well," she said lightly, "the board can review that. Most residents find it easier to simply join. The monthly dues are minimal, only $600, and auto withdrawal ensures you stay in good standing." 600. I had laughed before I could stop myself. Her cheeks stiffened. "Non-compliance complicates things. We take safety and order seriously in Willow Ridge. I'd hate for you to begin on the wrong foot." "I'll review everything," I said, taking the folder. "But I'm not signing today." She tucked a card into the front pocket. "We expect your paperwork by Friday. Welcome to the neighborhood, Mr. Remy." She'd walked back to her SUV, its paint so polished it reflected the entire ridge. As her engine faded into the trees, I remember flipping through the packet, pages and pages of rules, bylaws, diagrams of acceptable mailbox heights, prohibited livestock breeds, fencing styles, and on the last page, a blank form titled Mandatory Consent to HOA Governance. I'd closed the folder and tossed it onto a chair. That evening, after Lily had gone to bed, I stepped outside to breathe in the cold air. The stars were sharp and clear. The lake shimmered in the dark. A piece of paper fluttered at the gate, catching the porch light. I walked down the path and peeled it from the wood. Final HOA warning. Urgent response required. Underneath, in smaller letters, failure to comply may result in community action. I'd stared at those words until my breath turned to frost. Back in the present, my truck rolled to a stop near the small cabin by the water. I stepped out, gravel crunching beneath my boots. The moon hung low over the lake, turning the surface into a sheet of rippled silver. A faint movement made me pause. Something white was stuck to the cabin door. I walked closer, heart beating slow and steady. The paper was pinned under a rock, the edges curled from the wind. Notice of Community Safety Review. Mandatory inspection required within 48 hours. Failure to comply will result in corrective measures. Bethany always did have a talent for timing. I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket. Suspicion settled deeper. This wasn't about rules. It wasn't about safety. Someone wanted my land, my lake access, my water rights, my ridge. And if they were willing to set a house on fire, what else were they willing to do? Morning came slow and gray, the kind that makes the lake look like brushed steel. I stepped out of the cabin with a mug of coffee and felt the cold bite through my shirt. A thin layer of ash had settled on the porch overnight, carried down from the ridge where the house still smoldered. I wiped it away with my boot and stared up the dirt road that wound back toward the main property. Something white was tucked under the windshield wiper of my pickup. I didn't need to walk closer to know what it was. The paper was too crisp, too clean, too deliberate for the mountains to have put it there themselves. Still, I approached, each step crunching on loose gravel. Unauthorized livestock. Level 3 violation. Immediate corrective action required. $450 fine. I laughed once under my breath. A thin, humorless sound. The only livestock on my land were a pair of aging goats and one stubborn mule named Copper, and none of them had left their pen in months. The gate was locked, the fence was reinforced, but logic had never stopped a determined HOA. I folded the notice, slid it into the truck's glove compartment, and headed up the ridge toward the ruins of my home. As I climbed the last hill, the full shape of the damage came into view. The deck was gone. The roof had collapsed inward like a cracked eggshell. The garage door hung from a single twisted hinge. Fire investigators had placed bright yellow tags on the foundation, little splashes of color on a field of charcoal. But the part that made me stop wasn't the house. It was the mailbox, or what was left of it. The wooden post had been snapped clean in half, the metal box crushed beneath a tire track in the mud. A single envelope lay beside it, soaked and torn. It wasn't addressed from the county, not from the fire department, not from insurance. It was another notice. Unsafe gate, community hazard, mandatory HOA hearing to follow. The gate they meant was a sturdy cedar and iron structure my father had built by hand. It didn't lean, didn't sag, didn't pose danger to anything except the patience of people who wished it wasn't there. Behind me, tires rolled onto gravel. I turned to see a dust-colored Chevy rumble toward the property. The driver leaned out, Marcus Reed, my nearest neighbor on the eastern lot. He stepped out wearing a flannel shirt and a tired expression. "Jake," he said, scanning the burned structure. "Hell of a thing." "That's one word for it," I replied. He kicked lightly at a piece of charred wood. "Saw the flames from my porch last night. Called it in. Figured the whole ridge was about to go up." "I appreciate that." Marcus nodded. He had the look of a man carrying a weight he wasn't sure he should set down, but he did anyway. "Got a heads up for you," he said. "Bethany's been running her mouth all morning. Says the fire proves what she's been telling the board for months, that you're a threat to the community. That your non-compliance forced their hand." "My wiring forced their hand?" I asked. Her words, Marcus said. Not mine. I let out a slow breath. The cold air stung the back of my throat. There's more, he added. Rumor is, Preston's been trying to buy up land on this ridge for months. Folks who say no start getting violations, mysterious fines, harassment. You know how it goes. I did know. I'd seen similar patterns in federal cases, quiet pressure campaigns, selective enforcement, targeted intimidation. You don't need guns to steal land. Just paper, signatures, and the right people looking the other way. A gust of wind stirred a swirl of ash around us. Marcus reached into his truck and pulled out 3 more papers. Found these stuck to your gate on my way up, he said. I took them. More fines. More accusations. Illegal shoreline access, unregistered equipment, improper storage of materials. Each one more absurd than the last. What's the real play here? I asked. Marcus shrugged helplessly. Preston wants the ridge. Bethany wants control. You're the only one who told him no. And the only property with senior water rights, I said quietly. Marcus blinked. Water rights? My father filed them before the HOA existed, before your house was even built. My land controls all upstream access to the lake. He let out a low whistle. Well, that explains everything. It did. Water in Montana isn't just water. It's power, control, leverage. No developer stands a chance against a ranch that can legally block lake access. And somebody wanted that leverage gone. When Marcus left, I walked the property alone. The air hummed with distant engines, but otherwise the ridge was still. Too still. The blackened husk of my home loomed behind me, a silent accusation. I knelt near the garage entrance where the investigators had marked the supposed origin of the fire. The ground was muddy from the hoses, but near the far corner, something caught the light. A small, melted piece of plastic. I picked it up carefully. It was charred, warped, nearly unrecognizable. But one thing stood out. The faint, curved outline of a handle. A gas can handle. I closed my hand around it. Paper bullets were one thing. False fines, bogus violations. They could bury a man in enough paperwork to make him beg for surrender. But arson? That wasn't paper. That was escalation. I stood and looked back down the ridge, toward Willow Ridge's perfect lawns and identical mailboxes and Bethany Whitfield's screaming pink blazer. If this was their opening move, they weren't just trying to pressure me. They were trying to erase me. That thought followed me the next morning as I drove Lily to school. She sat beside me, backpack hugged tight to her chest, her hair braided loosely the way her mother used to do it. The sky above Redwater Ridge was washed out blue, the kind that promised cold even after the sun climbed over the pines. Nothing looked dangerous. Nothing looked wrong. And yet the air felt heavier than usual, thick with something I couldn't name. Dad? She said softly. Are we safe here? It was a question no child should have to ask. I kept my eyes on the road. We're safer here than anywhere else, I told her. This land is ours. She nodded, but the way she kept looking over her shoulder told me she didn't quite believe it. I dropped her off at the front entrance, watched her walk to the doors with that too old posture grief always gives a young person. She disappeared inside. I waited a second longer, then turned the truck toward the ridge again. My burned home looked worse in daylight. The sun illuminated every jagged edge, every twisted beam. Smoke still curled from a few spots like stubborn ghosts refusing to leave. I stood there a long time, breathing in the smell of wet ash and cedar, trying to ignore the churn in my chest. A truck pulled up behind me. The sound of tires on gravel was becoming familiar these days. This time, though, it wasn't a neighbor. It was the mailman, Sam Weller. He stepped out, hat in hand, face already apologizing. "Jake, I've got something here I think you ought to see." He handed me a bundle of letters and 2 bright orange envelopes. HOA Notice of Non-Compliance HOA Community. Hearing schedule immediate response required. The dates were yesterday. They were always yesterday. Sam lowered his voice. "I've been delivering up here 20 years. Never seen an HOA move this fast on anybody. Not even the folks who installed those illegal solar panels." "Appreciate the warning," I told him. He hesitated, then added, "Watch your back. Bethany's been talking loud this morning." He left and I tucked the notices into the truck door, but I didn't open them. I didn't need to. I knew the pattern now. This was pressure, paper pressure, harassment that looked official enough to scare the average homeowner into paying or selling or both. But they underestimated one thing. I wasn't average. The day passed slowly. I spoke with the fire investigator again, walked the perimeter of the ruins, retrieved what little had survived the heat. Mostly metal, hinges, tools, the twisted frame of a picture that had once held my wife's smile. I was heading back toward the cabin when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I answered anyway. "This is Jake." A voice on the other end was panicked, breathless. "Mr. Remy, this is Nurse Coleman from Redwater Middle. Lily collapsed during second period. She's breathing, but she's disoriented. Paramedics are on the way." The world dropped out from under my feet. I don't remember getting in the truck. I don't remember the drive. Just the sound of loose gravel spitting under my tires, the blur of the pines, and the violent thump of my heartbeat filling the cab. By the time I reached the school, an ambulance was already parked out front. A knot of students stood nearby, faces pale with worry. I pushed through the small crowd and saw 2 EMTs kneeling beside Lily on the sidewalk. She was sitting up, leaning against the brick wall, her face drained of color. "Dad," she whispered, reaching out a trembling hand. I knelt beside her, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm here. I've got you." The EMT ran through what they'd found. Rapid heartbeat, dizziness, a sudden collapse. She'd been sitting at her desk, drinking from her water bottle, when she'd slumped forward. They didn't smell alcohol or medication, but something wasn't right. "We're taking her in for tests," he said. "We don't like guessing with symptoms like these." I nodded, but my eyes were scanning the scene. The backpack lying open, the water bottle half crushed, kids whispering, teachers trying to keep order. Then, near the front doors, something caught my eye. A woman in a yellow HOA polo, arms crossed, watching, not helping, not worried, just watching. When she saw me looking, she slipped inside the building. At the hospital, Lily's vitals stabilized. Her color returned slowly, like a sunrise pushing back the night. The doctor said they found traces of something unusual. A stimulant, prescription strength, nothing a child should ever be exposed to. "Has she been taking any medication?" he asked. "No," I said, "and she never will unless I hand it to her myself." He looked concerned but said he'd need the school's cooperation for further tests. I thanked him, then stepped into the hallway, closing the door behind me. My grief didn't explode. It didn't shout. It tightened, became something narrow and sharp. I pulled out my phone and opened the school's security portal, a public system for parents to check entry logs during emergencies. It didn't give full footage, but enough thumbnails for me to get a timeline. One stood out. A still frame from the cafeteria corridor. Timestamp, 11:43 a.m. 10 minutes before Lily collapsed. A woman in a yellow HOA polo bending over a row of backpacks, her hand hovering near one. Lily's. I zoomed in. The face was grainy, but the hair was unmistakable. Brenda Wilson, HOA board member, friend of Bethany, and the same woman who'd been watching us outside the school. My stomach turned cold. This wasn't harassment. This wasn't intimidation. This was an attack on my child. I leaned against the wall and took one long, steadying breath. In 15 years on the federal bench, I'd learned a simple truth. People reveal themselves fastest when they feel untouchable. And everyone in Willow Ridge, Bethany, Tyler, Brenda, Preston, believed they were untouchable. It was time to let them think I was breaking. It was time to disappear into silence. Because in silence, I worked best. By the time I brought Lily home from the hospital, the sun had begun to slip behind Redwater Ridge, throwing long shadows across the burned shell of our house. The chimney stood like a broken tooth. The porch where I used to drink coffee with my wife was nothing but blackened boards and cooled ash. I parked the truck near the barn, one of the few structures untouched, and helped Lily inside. She was tired but steady on her feet, the color returning to her cheeks. "I'm okay, Dad," she murmured, though her voice still wavered. "You don't have to hover." "You collapsed at school," I reminded her gently. "Hovering is part of the job description." She managed a small smile and carried her backpack to the guest room in the barn loft. I tucked an extra blanket around her shoulders before going downstairs. When I stepped outside, the evening air met me with that familiar Montana bite. Clean, sharp, honest, unlike the people I was dealing with. I closed the barn door behind me softly, and the moment it latched, everything inside me shifted. The grieving father faded. The rancher faded. What remained was the man I had been before Redwater Ridge, the man I had tried to stop being after my wife's passing, the man who had spent 15 years dismantling corruption, one paper-thin lie at a time. I walked toward the ridge overlooking the lake. Redwater Lake sat quiet, its surface catching the last streaks of gold from the fading sky. A few ducks cut through the water in lazy turns. This place, this land, had always been sanctuary to me. The idea that someone would poison it with greed turned every breath into steel. Marcus Reed arrived just as the shadows deepened. His pickup rattled up my drive, headlights sweeping across the field. When he climbed out, he held a thermos under one arm and a coil of wire in his hand. "You look worse than usual," he said by way of greeting. "And you look like a man who's brought me trouble," I replied. He cracked a smile. "Wouldn't be the first time." We walked together to the far corner of the property near the old cedar grove. Marcus knelt beside a fence post and pulled out a small drill. "Camera goes here," he said. "Angle down toward the trail they keep sneaking through." "You really think they'll come across the same way?" I asked. He gave me a hard look. "People like them always pick the same habits. Makes them feel invisible." We installed the first camera, then two more near the boathouse, one under the overhang, one inside a hollow cedar post I'd carved out myself years ago. Marcus adjusted the settings, syncing the feeds to a secure drive inside my truck. "You sure you want to poke the hornet's nest?" he asked quietly. "I'm not poking anything," I said. "They're the ones burning houses and tampering with children's drinks. I'm just hitting record." Marcus exhaled. "Fair point." When he left, I returned to the barn and locked the doors with new, reinforced bolts. I checked on Lily once more. She was asleep, breathing evenly. Afterward, I drove into town, parking near the attorney's office whose name I'd seen on a dozen water rights cases. Sarah Coleman, Environmental and Property Law. Her office was lit. A lamp glowed against the frosted glass. I knocked, and a moment later she opened the door, wearing a denim shirt, dark jeans, and an expression that said she'd seen every trick in the book. "Mr. Remy?" she asked. "Marcus said you might stop by." "I'm not sure if I need legal help," I said, but I need the truth." She stepped aside. Truth is my favorite kind of retainer. Inside, her office smelled faintly of cedar and printer ink. Maps lined the walls, water tables, flow rights, easements, old surveys from long-abandoned homesteads. "What do you know about the Willow Ridge HOA?" I asked. She let out a slow whistle. "Enough to wish they'd stayed in whatever hole they crawled out of. But I take it you're looking for specifics?" "Yes." She pulled a binder from her shelf and handed it over. Inside were photocopies of letters, email printouts, and scanned documents stamped with the HOA seal. "These letters," she said, pointing to the first page, "were sent to several homeowners last year, claiming new environmental restrictions, new shore regulations, new water protection zones." "None of that sounds legal," I murmured. "It wasn't. They forged half of these. County never issued new shoreline regulations. State Water Office confirmed no additional controls. But this HOA used fake environmental pressure to seize control of lake access. They started telling people where they could fish, where they could dock, even when they could mow their grass. And nobody fought back? "A few tried," she said. "They were fined into silence, or scared off, or bought out." The pieces were beginning to snap together. "Bought out by who?" "Preston Hale," she said, her tone flat. "Developer. Likes to wear cowboy hats to hide the fact he hasn't ridden a horse in his life." I felt something cold and sharp slide into place inside me. "So the HOA and Hale are connected." "Oh, they're more than connected," she said, leaning forward. "They're partners. Money moves between their accounts like a two-lane highway." I ran a thumb along the edge of the binder. "Can I make copies?" "You can keep the whole thing," she said. "Something tells me you're not collecting these for a scrapbook." Back at the ranch, the night was still. Too still. Even the crickets seemed to pause when I pulled up to the barn. I stepped out slowly, listening to the wind sweep through the pines and brush against the tin roof. Inside, my laptop was already set up on the workbench. I loaded the camera feeds, watched the flickering infrared video from each corner of the property. Empty trails, silent water. Nothing moving except the wind. Good. Let them think I was quiet. Let them think I was broken. In silence, I had room to gather every paper, every fraud, every forged letter, each one a piece in a larger pattern. By the time the moon climbed above Redwater Ridge, I had my first clear picture of what this was. Not an HOA, not a petty fight, not even greed. This was a coordinated land grab operation, and they'd chosen the wrong ranch, because a man who knows the law can turn silence into a weapon sharper than any blade. By the end of the week, the rumor I wanted to spread had already taken flight. Whispered at the hardware store, murmured outside the diner, repeated by the clerk at the gas station who thought he was being subtle. Word traveled the way it always does in small Montana towns. Quiet at first, then louder, then amplified until the whole ridge seemed to hum with it. "Jake's taking a consulting trip, out of town for a couple days." I didn't correct a single soul. Instead, I let it settle, let it spread, let it find exactly the ears it needed. On Friday evening, I parked my truck on the old service road above Redwater Ridge. From here, the whole ranch lay below me like a quiet map, dark pine silhouettes framing the burned shell of the house, the barn sitting sturdy and weathered beside the pasture, and the lake glinting faintly through the trees. I cracked the window. The night air carried the smell of sap and cool water, a calm that felt undeserved. Inside the cab, 4 camera feeds glowed on my laptop screen. Everything was ready, every trail monitored, every blind spot mapped, every mistake they thought they had erased, about to be written back in ink. At 2:04 a.m., the first alert chimed. Motion near the west gate. I leaned forward. letting the grainy night vision footage sharpen. 3 figures moved along the fence line, all dressed in dark clothing. Their shadows stretched behind them as they ducked under the pines, carrying something bulky, something metal, something heavy. Gas cans. My jaw tightened. I felt no fear, no surprise, only the cold finality of confirmation. At 2:17 a.m., the same cursed hour these people always seemed to prefer, they stepped onto my property. Tyler Whitfield led the group, his hood pulled low. Behind him were 2 men I didn't recognize, though their movements were practiced enough to suggest this wasn't their first job under moonlight. Tyler paused at the edge of the ruined porch. "Right where she said," he muttered, voice caught clearly by the hidden microphone beneath the cedar post. He uncapped the first gas can. I watched gasoline splash across the blackened boards, running into seams and cracks like it remembered the last fire. One of the men walked around back, sloshing fuel along the barn wall, testing the door handle. Finding it locked, he grunted and splashed more across the frame. They were confident, too confident. Like people who had done this before, like people who expected to get away with it again. Tyler struck a match. In the night vision feed, the flame bloomed white, flaring bright enough to wash out the grass. Then came the ignition, a sudden eruption of heat and light as the old porch caught. Fire tore upward, licking at the railings, leaping from board to board. The second man stepped back, shielding his face while Tyler watched with a satisfaction that hammered something hard into my chest. I closed my eyes for one slow breath. 15 years on the bench had shown me every flavor of human cruelty, but arson carried its own smell, a mix of destruction, cowardice, and arrogance. And here they were, committing it like a routine task, as if burning down a man's home was just another line on their to-do list. The moment the flames reached the threshold, my fire system activated. The cameras shook as a burst of pressure released. A high alarm sounded, echoing across the property. Then came the hiss of the suppressant jets, heavy mist blanketing the porch. Tyler froze. The men beside him spun around like spooked cattle. "What the? Why's it doing that?" one of them hissed. "It wasn't supposed to trip yet," Tyler snapped. He looked toward the road, the place they thought I wasn't. The place they thought was empty. The place where my truck now rolled quietly downhill. I kept my headlights off, using the soft moonlight to guide me. The fire trucks would be here in less than 4 minutes. My direct line had already sent the call. I didn't need to intervene directly. I just needed to see their faces when the plan fell apart. By the time I reached the end of the drive, the suppressant had smothered most of the fire. Smoke still curled off the boards, drifting into the night sky like pale ghosts. Tyler and his men bolted toward the trees, slipping in the wet grass. One of them looked back, and for a split second, our eyes met through the glow. Not fear, not guilt, just irritation, like a man annoyed that his chore had taken longer than expected. That was when the first siren echoed through the valley. Red lights washed across the lake. Engines rumbled as the volunteer fire crew sped down the dirt road, gravel spraying from their tires. 2 sheriff's deputies followed behind, though neither seemed eager to be the first on scene. The firemen jumped out, shouting commands, dragging hoses, and Bethany was not far behind. Her sedan screeched to a stop at the end of the road, and she stepped out wearing a silk robe over her nightclothes, as if she'd been yanked from bed in distress. But her eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, betrayed something else. Annoyance. "You again," she snapped at the nearest firefighter. "Why are there so many trucks? This is just another electrical short. These old ranch homes." I stepped into the wash of the emergency lights. Her voice cut off. "Evening, Bethany," I said quietly. She didn't move at first. Couldn't, maybe. The reflection of the flames danced across her pink robe, making it look like she herself had been dipped in firelight. I saw her glance past me, toward the barn, toward the dark trail where Tyler had run. She was looking for him. Good. That meant she already knew. What are you doing here? She demanded, recovering her composure. I thought you were out of town. Funny how often your information is wrong, I said. She swallowed, tightening her robe around her shoulders. This wasn't our doing. You must have left something plugged in. Or maybe it was leftover damage from the first fire. There won't be a third, I said. She flinched, just for a breath, just for a heartbeat, but enough. Behind her, one of the firefighters called out, "Suppression system engaged early. Looks intentional." Bethany's lips pressed into a white line. "Officer," she shouted toward a deputy, "make sure he doesn't interfere with the investigation." But the deputy only lifted a shoulder. "Fire captain's in charge here, ma'am." She spun back to me, eyes blazing hotter than the dying fire behind her. "You're finished here, Jake Remy. You hear me? You're finished." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't step toward her. I didn't need to. "Bethany," I said softly, "your problem is that you think you're the only one who knows how to play a long game." I took one step back, letting the firelight fall fully on my face. "You're wrong." For the first time since this war began, I saw something in her expression that wasn't confidence. Doubt. She didn't know what I had. She didn't know how much I knew. And she didn't know the truth that would matter most. This wasn't just arson. This wasn't just fraud. This wasn't just harassment. This crossed state and federal lines were my specialty. By sunrise, the fire trucks were gone, leaving wet streaks across the driveway and the faint smell of suppressant chemicals clinging to the morning air. Steam drifted lazily off the scorched boards like ghosts rising with the dawn. The sky over Redwater Ridge glowed pale blue, calm as a photograph, too calm for everything that was about to unfold. I stood alone beside what used to be my front porch, boots sinking slightly into the soaked dirt. The remains of the night looked almost peaceful, as if the land itself had taken a deep breath after holding in the chaos. But the truth was clear. This wasn't the end of the attack. This was only the end of their confidence. Because last night, for the first time, the HOA's facade cracked. Bethany had shown up too quickly. Tyler had run like a man with more to fear than trespassing. And the deputies had been far too uninterested in doing their jobs. It was a pattern I'd seen before. In courtrooms, in depositions, in midnight calls from agents who needed warrants fast. When criminals felt time closing in on them, they didn't settle down. They scrambled. And scrambling always left footprints. Marcus arrived mid-morning, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a look that wasn't quite sympathy, but wasn't far from it. He handed me the stronger cup without speaking, then stared at the blackened porch. "I saw the trucks heading out," he said. "Heard the chatter on the radio. You all right?" "I'm not the one who should be worried," I replied quietly. He nodded slowly. "Good. Because the whole ridge is talking. Folks know something's off. Never seen the Whitfields look so rattled." We walked the perimeter together. The grass along the porch was still flattened from the weight of the men who'd run through it. Tyler's footprints were deeper. He'd been carrying the 3rd can. The marks led straight toward the pines and vanished into the thick brush. Marcus squatted near the tree line. "They dropped something." He handed me a torn piece of fabric, a scrap of dark material with a fleck of yellow paint. It was nothing on its own. But in context, it was one more thread to pull. I pocketed it. "Let the sheriff try to explain that away." "If he even shows up," Marcus muttered. The sheriff didn't. Not that morning. Not that day. Instead, around noon, My phone buzzed with an email from the HOA. Subject: Community Safety Update. Body: Due to recent property damage incidents, the HOA urges all homeowners to comply with community standards to ensure neighborhood safety. At the bottom, Bethany had signed her name with her usual flourish, 3 loops under her initials like a queen signing royal decrees. I read it twice, not in anger, but in recognition. Some people confessed with their words. Others confessed with their patterns. Bethany Whitfield confessed with both. I forwarded the email to Sarah Coleman. She called within minutes. "This is escalating faster than I expected," she said. "The forged environmental letters were already enough for a civil suit. But arson? Coordinated intimidation? You're looking at criminal fraud and conspiracy charges, possibly even racketeering." "Tell me something I don't know," I said. "All right." Her tone shifted. "Your suppression system didn't just save the barn. It bought you something else. Time. Time for what? Time to take federal jurisdiction." The words landed like a stone dropped into calm water. I stepped outside the barn, staring across the lake as Sarah spoke. The wind carried the scent of pine needles and wet soil. A hawk circled above, its shadow gliding along the ridge. Everything in nature still moved with its own laws, steady, balanced, uncorrupted. Humans were another matter. "Water rights make this interstate," she continued. "Remember the forged lakeshore letters? Those came from a P.O. box registered across state lines. And Preston Hale's development company? Delaware Corporation, Montana Properties, Wyoming bank accounts." "So we're past local law enforcement," I murmured. "Far past. Jake, this is big. You need to bring in the feds." I closed my eyes, letting the truth settle in my bones. It fit too cleanly, too sharply. A puzzle snapping into place after months of scattered edges. "I will," I said, "but not yet." "Why not yet?" "Because they still think I'm just a rancher who lost his home," I replied. "They still think I'm grieving, broken, alone. They're comfortable." "And comfortable criminals make mistakes," she finished. "Exactly." When I hung up, I returned to the burned porch. I knelt, touching the edge of the charred boards. The wood was rough beneath my fingers, splintered, brittle, but still solid where the suppressant had soaked through. Ashes didn't lie. Fire didn't lie. And footage certainly didn't lie. I glanced toward the cedar grove, where my cameras sat hidden in the knots of old wood. One of them had caught the clearest shot of Tyler's face when the suppressant hit. A moment of shock frozen in time. A moment that would end this entire operation. But timing mattered. Approach mattered. Pressure mattered. And right now, Bethany believed she had the upper hand. That belief would make her reckless. Right on cue, as if summoned by my thoughts, a familiar shrill voice cut across the quiet. "You can't keep blocking the road like this!" Bethany's pink SUV screeched to a halt in front of the burned house. She stepped out wearing yet another floral pantsuit. This one green and yellow, clashing with the somber landscape. She clutched a stack of papers in one hand, and her fury in the other. "You've attracted enough emergency vehicles to lower our property values for a year," she snapped. "This is exactly why we need stronger HOA oversight." I remained where I stood, arms loose at my sides, posture calm. "Bethany," I said, "I'm a little busy picking up the pieces from last night." "You caused last night," she spat. "Your negligence did." There it was again. The lie too fragile to hold its weight. "Let me guess," I said. "Electrical fire?" She blinked, only for a fraction of a second, but enough to confirm she'd tried rehearsing the story. "You need to let Tyler's company make you an offer," she pressed on. "It's the only reasonable path forward." Your home is unsafe. This entire ridge is unsafe with you refusing to participate in community standards. Community standards, I repeated softly. That's what you call forgery? Fraud? Intimidation? Extortion? She froze. And for the third time since this war began, I saw it. Doubt, fear, recognition. She didn't know what I knew. She didn't know how I knew it. And she didn't know the most important truth of all. I wasn't building a case anymore. I already had one. Bethany, I said quietly, you should go home. She swallowed, eyes darting between me and the remains of the house. This isn't over, she hissed. I held her gaze. No, I said, it isn't. She left too quickly. Tires spinning, gravel scattering. People only fled like that when they felt a net tightening around them. And my net had just begun to close. The next 48 hours moved with the stillness of deep water, quiet on the surface, currents churning underneath. I spent most of that time in the barn loft with Lily, who was recovering faster than the doctors expected. She slept in late, curled under a quilt her mother had sewn years ago, the morning light spilling through the slats in soft, golden stripes. Whenever she stirred, I was there. But whenever she slept, I was somewhere else entirely. Back in the role I'd tried to bury. On Sunday morning, with the frost still clinging to the edges of the pasture grass, I walked down the barn stairs and stepped outside. The lake was flat as glass, catching the reflection of the ridge line like a second world hidden under the water. For the first time in days, Redwater felt calm. That calm would not last. I unlocked the truck, slid into the driver's seat, and pulled a slim black folder from beneath the passenger floorboard. The folder had remained untouched since the day I moved back. I'd promised myself I would never open it again. But promises made in peace don't always survive war. Inside were 2 credentials, a federal judicial identification card and the restricted access badge I'd used for years to move through secure buildings most people never knew existed. The ID photo showed a younger version of me, clean-shaven, sharp-eyed, still wearing the weight of the job like a fitted coat instead of a burden. Judge Jacob Remington, the title I'd sworn to leave behind. I ran my thumb over the edge of the card, feeling the raised seal press back. Then I placed it in my inside jacket pocket and turned the key in the ignition. By the time the sun had risen fully, I was parked behind an unmarked government sedan outside a diner 15 miles from Redwater Ridge. The parking lot was empty except for a delivery truck and a half-asleep teenager sweeping the sidewalk. Inside the sedan sat the 2 people I'd called when I realized no local agency could handle what the HOA had become. Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Dunn and Deputy Marshal Carter Willis. They stepped out when I pulled beside them. Dunn looked crisp and composed as always, hair pinned neatly, coat collar straight. Marshal Willis, on the other hand, carried the rugged posture of a man who preferred mountains to paperwork, broad shoulders, worn boots, steady eyes. Judge Remington, Dunn greeted quietly. It's been a while. I shook her hand. Jake will do. Sure, she said, though the flicker in her eyes told me she still saw the title. You said this couldn't wait. It can't. We moved into the diner, taking a booth in the back where no one could overhear us. The waitress poured 3 coffees and disappeared. Outside, the frost on the windows began to melt, leaving long vertical streaks through which the morning light filtered like thin gold ribbons. What do you have? Dunn asked. I opened my laptop. The first video, Tyler splashing, gasoline across my porch. The second, the 2 masked men circling the barn. The third, the moment the suppressant system triggered. Their faces remained impassive but focused, eyes narrowing as they pieced together the pattern behind the flames. Arson, Willis said quietly. On occupied property. Not vandalism, Dunn added. Not a prank. Intent to destroy a residence. Correct, I said. I clicked again. 4 more videos appeared. Footage taken from the Cedar cameras throughout the past month. Tyler and a second man trespassing. Bethany and Preston arguing near the lakeshore. HOA board members discussing pressure tactics. Wait, Dunn said, leaning forward. Play that part again. I rewound 10 seconds. Played it. On screen, Bethany's voice crackled through the hidden mic as she whispered fiercely to Preston Hale. If he won't join, he'll leave one way or another. The developer wants contiguous land. Make him understand that. Dunn exhaled slowly. That's extortion. Pure and simple. Crossing state lines, I reminded them. Preston's development accounts are in Wyoming and Delaware. The forged environmental letters came from a P.O. box in Idaho. Dunn's pen hovered above her notebook. Interstate fraud. Federal jurisdiction confirmed. Willis didn't speak. He simply nodded once, a silent signal that the pieces were fitting. Next, I opened the binder Sarah Coleman had given me. Dunn flipped through the pages, stopping on the forged environmental letter with the county seal. This is sloppy work, she muttered. Wrong font, wrong stamp date. They weren't expecting anyone to look too closely. They didn't expect a judge, I said. That earned the faintest smile from Willis. Dunn closed the binder. Judge, Jake, this is enough to open an investigation immediately. But if we're going after all of them, Bethany, Tyler, Preston, the board members, anyone else involved, we'll need airtight evidence. Confessions or recorded discussions tying them directly to motive. I can get that, I said. On the record? She asked. Yes. And safely? I hesitated. I'll handle it. Willis studied me for a long moment. You know how dangerous cornered people can be. I know, I said. But they still think I'm the one with the target on my back. They have no idea who they're actually dealing with. Dunn set her pen down firmly. We'll begin the paperwork for a federal case, but don't push them into action. Let them come to you. People like this. Eventually, they brag. I nodded. She leaned in. When they do, make sure your recorder is running. When we stepped out of the diner, the sun had risen fully, warming the frost off the pavement. The wind swept softly across the lot, carrying the smell of pine and cold earth. It felt like the beginning of something. Not relief, not safety, but momentum. A shift. Willis shook my hand. You've got backup now. They just don't know it yet. Dunn added, when you're ready to make your move, call us. I watched their sedan pull away, the dust rising behind it and drifting across the empty highway. Then I drove back toward Redwater Ridge, toward the lake, toward my daughter, toward the battle that wasn't quite a battle yet. But it would be. When I turned into my driveway, Bethany's SUV was parked near the broken mailbox. She stood beside it, arms crossed tightly, expression sharp enough to cut steel. I pulled up slowly, stepped out, closed the door without hurry. You're harder to get rid of than I thought, she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were terrified. Good, I replied. Means I'm doing my job. She blinked. Your job? I took one step closer, just close enough for her to see the corner of the federal badge inside my jacket when the wind lifted the lapel. For the first time, Bethany Whitfield went silent. She didn't know what she'd seen. She didn't know how much I'd heard. And she didn't know the truth that would end everything. I wasn't just Jake Remy of Redwater Ridge. I was Judge Jacob Remington. And now the law was awake. By the time the next week rolled around, the mountains were dusted with a fresh layer of snow, thin and quiet like powdered sugar. Winter was creeping down the slopes, ready to claim the valley. Redwater Lake turned darker with the early cold, its surface stiffening under the chill wind. Everything felt hushed, waiting, like the land itself knew something was coming. And something was. Bethany, Tyler, and Preston had grown bold in their panic. They sent 2 more notices, both filled with empty threats. They staged community patrols, driving slowly past my ranch, headlights lingering too long. They whispered to neighbors. They spun stories. They tried to set the stage for my exit. But they also made the one mistake that always undid people like them. They believed I was still the man they thought they'd broken. So when an email arrived inviting me to a neutral mediation meeting at Hale Development's legal office, I knew the trap wasn't just set. It was trembling, ready to snap shut. Perfect. Lily was stable. Cameras were hidden across my truck, jacket, and shirt collar. The federal recorder, secure, timestamp stamped, rested in my inner pocket. Dunn and Marshall Willis waited less than 15 minutes away, and I walked into that meeting, carrying the one thing none of them had: the truth. The office was a modern glass and stone building on the edge of town, polished enough to deceive most people into trusting whatever contracts came out of it. Inside, the receptionist directed me down a hallway to a conference room overlooking the empty parking lot. Bethany sat at the head of the table. Tyler lounged beside her, leg bouncing nervously. Preston Hale leaned back in his chair, cowboy hat on the table in front of him like some kind of theatrical prop. And their attorney, a man named Clayton Reeves, adjusted his tie like he was preparing for a commercial shoot. "Jake," Reeves said smoothly, "glad you could make it. Let's all get this resolved." Resolved. What a polite word for coercion. I took the seat opposite them, offering nothing but a quiet nod. Bethany folded her hands. "We understand you've had difficulties managing the ranch alone. Fires, unsafe structures, medical emergencies." Tyler smirked. "Seems like you've been under a lot of pressure." Pressure. From them. Reeves slid a folder across the table. "This is a generous offer from Preston's company. 60% of the pre-fire value paid immediately, no questions asked. It's a chance for you and your daughter to move somewhere less volatile." Volatile. Preston leaned forward. "You don't have to rebuild, Jake. Let us help you. Everyone wins." I opened the folder. Blank contract pages waited underneath a printed offer with a number so low, it would have been an insult even without the arson. I looked up. "And in exchange?" Reeves smiled thinly. "You'll drop any complaints. Agree the fires were accidental. Confirm that the HOA acted within its right to request compliance." Bethany lifted her chin, emboldened. "We're trying to give you an off-ramp, Jake. You should take it." I kept my voice calm, steady. "And if I don't?" Tyler answered with a quiet, rehearsed shrug. "Things happen. Insurance gets tricky. Property values dip. Investigations stall. Why drag this out?" I pressed a hand flat on the table. "That's interesting," I said softly. "Because none of you mentioned the cameras." Bethany stiffened. "What cameras?" "The ones you missed," I replied. Reeves shifted uncomfortably. "Jake, let's not escalate." I clicked the tiny recorder hidden in my jacket. "Please," I said, "continue explaining how the fires were, what did you call them? A wake-up call." Preston's face paled. "Nobody said that." "You did," I said, tapping the folder. "Right before you said sometimes a neighbor needs a little push." Bethany's eyes darted to Tyler. "Don't say another word," she hissed. But the damage was already done. I leaned back in my chair, voice as quiet as a winter creek. "I think we're done pretending." Then I turned my head slightly toward the door. "Come in." The glass door opened. Badges glinted. Footsteps echoed. Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Dunn entered first, followed by Marshall Willis and 2 more federal agents. The air shifted instantly, pressure tightening, truth flooding the room like icy water. Dunn set a thick folder on the table. Bethany Whitfield, Tyler Whitfield, Preston Hale, federal agents have a warrant for your arrest. Bethany shot to her feet. This is outrageous. We're having a private business discussion. Willis stepped forward. Not when it crosses into extortion, fraud, and interstate arson conspiracy. Tyler's mouth opened, then shut again like a fish struggling for air. Preston reached for his hat, as if somehow wearing it would restore control. Bethany pointed a trembling finger at me. Who the hell do you think you are? It was time. I removed my sunglasses and set them gently on the table, letting silence stretch long enough for her fear to bloom fully. My name, I said plainly, is Judge Jacob Remington. She staggered back a step, the color draining from her face like someone had wiped it away. Federal judge? She whispered. Yes, Dunn answered. And he's been cooperating with our investigation from the beginning. Tyler tried to run. The marshals caught him before he reached the door. Preston stammered, I didn't know. No one told me. This wasn't my... Save it, Willis said, snapping handcuffs shut. Anything you say from here is on the record. Bethany's voice cracked, desperate. You can't do this. We have rights. Correct, I replied softly. And so do the people you've been terrorizing. She froze, tears welling, not from remorse, but from the realization that her empire was dust. The marshals guided them out one by one, their protests fading down the hallway. And for the first time since the night my house burned, the air in my chest felt light. Not because they were gone, because justice had finally taken the wheel.